A Korean Mafia boss couldn't sleep for 6 years, until his new black maid arrived. Part 2. 6 years. For 6 long years, the most feared Mafia boss in Seoul had not slept through a single night. Doctors prescribed everything: sedatives, therapy, specialists flown in from Zurich and Tokyo who charged fortunes and delivered nothing. Every night at exactly 1:17 a.m., Jae-hyun would tear himself out of the same waking nightmare. Not a dream, a memory. The night Ji-yoon stepped in front of a bullet that was meant for him. His mansion became a mausoleum of everything he couldn't bury. Servants lasted weeks before they quit. Security rotated in haunted silence. Even Mrs. Yoon, the one woman who had managed this household for over a decade, had learned to move through the corridors like a ghost, touching nothing, saying less. Until one evening, without announcement or ceremony, a new maid arrived. A young woman named Chioma, who walked through those heavy iron gates as though she had not received the warning everyone else had. And somehow, impossibly, on the very first night she stepped into that kitchen and began to hum. The man who had not slept in 6 years finally closed his eyes. But when his personal physician arrived at the mansion the following morning, braced for the usual devastation, what he found stopped him completely in his tracks. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here, you already know we don't do ordinary stories. Today we go deeper into the world of Jae-hyun, the man who built an empire from silence, who commanded entire rooms without raising his voice, and who, for 6 years, could not outrun a single memory. And Chioma, the woman who walked into his darkness not to fix it, but simply to stay. Subscribe if you're new, hit that notification bell, and let's step into part 2 of The Mafia Boss and the Maid. To the outside world, Jae-hyun was untouchable. In the steel and glass skyline of Seoul, his name passed through boardrooms and back alleys the same way. Low, careful, like a word you didn't say twice. He was precision made flesh. No theatrics. No raised voice. Only a particular, lethal stillness that had a way of collapsing negotiations before a single number was spoken. Seasoned rivals who had survived decades in Seoul's underworld found reasons not to meet his eyes. His suits were architecture. His silence was policy. Men who had ordered violence without flinching grew careful in his presence. He was, by every visible measure, a man completely in command of his world. But when the Han River caught the last of the sun and Seoul's lights began their cold, glittering climb into the night sky, the empire inside him began to crack. In the vast silence of his mansion, it happened the same way every time. He would stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows and watch the city outside settle into the ordinary mercy of sleep. Millions of lives exhaling, letting go, while he remained locked at the glass like a man pressing his face against something he was no longer allowed to enter. The chandeliers above him threw light that felt less like warmth and more like exposure. The art on his walls, each piece worth more than most people earned in a decade, felt less like luxury and more like evidence. Proof of everything he had traded away and could no longer return. By 11 p.m., his hands would begin to remember. Not the empire, not the decisions. The hands remembered her. The weight of Ji-yoon in his arms in that underground parking structure, the warmth leaving her far faster than his mind could accept. He would move to his bedroom, white marble, cathedral ceilings, silence so complete it had its own texture, and lie flat on his back like a man awaiting sentencing. His eyes would find the clock on the wall with the same helpless precision every night. 1:12. The air shifted. 1:15. His jaw locked. His pulse climbed to the surface of his skin. He breathed in controlled, shallow pulls, the last reflex of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to appear breakable, now reduced to counting seconds against himself. 1:16. He stopped breathing entirely. Not because he had forgotten, because he always knew exactly what was coming next. And at 1:17 a.m., right on time, the world fell apart. It was never simply a memory. It detonated. A phantom crack of sound behind his eyes. The suppressed gunshot he had heard only once but would spend 6 years hearing again and again and again. His body would seize in the reflex of that moment. The lurch forward, the arms that caught her, the cold underground fog of the Han River Plaza parking structure wrapping around everything. He felt it in his muscles. The weight of her body collapsing into his. The warmth of her blood against his shirt. Her fingers, weaker than he had ever felt them, finding his collar and holding on. Her eyes were never angry when they found his. They were only sad. "You promised you'd choose life," she had whispered. Then her hand fell, and the world broke in a way that 6 years had not yet finished breaking. Not at the moment Min-kyu received the news across the city. Fingers stilling against his polished desk, something dangerous shifting behind his patience. Not at the moment Mrs. Yoon noticed the mansion's air had changed in a way she couldn't name. Not even at the moment Jae-hyun opened his eyes to sunlight and lay completely still, not trusting the quiet. It begins the night before all of that. The night Chioma arrived. Min-kyu had a gift that most men in their world mistook for weakness. He waited, where other men in Seoul's underworld ruled through spectacle, through the crack of knuckles, through raised voices and broken furniture, and the particular theater of violence that kept subordinates trembling. Min-kyu ruled through something far more dangerous. Stillness. He had learned early that the most lethal thing a man could do in a room full of powerful people was simply nothing. No reaction. No urgency. Just patient, unblinking attention, the kind that made men feel simultaneously invisible and completely exposed. He had watched careers dissolve under that gaze. Had watched rivals overextend themselves trying to provoke a reaction he never gave them. It was, in its own quiet way, a form of torture. His office above the Han River was a study in that same discipline. No unnecessary furniture. No vanity. Floor-to-ceiling glass faced the water, and on clear mornings the light came through flat and cold and honest, the way Min-kyu preferred things. A single desk, 2 chairs, and on that desk, nothing but a phone, a glass of water, and whatever information had arrived most recently. This morning the information had arrived early. "Say it again," he said. The man across from him, young, careful, the kind of careful that came from having made one mistake already, swallowed once before speaking. "They confirmed it this morning, sir." He slept. Not for an hour. For most of the night. Min-kyu did not move. Outside, a cargo vessel pushed slowly through the Han River's gray water, indifferent to everything. A lesser man might have let something show. Surprise, excitement, the involuntary flash of opportunity crossing the eyes. Min-kyu gave the vessel his attention for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said, 6 years. It wasn't a question. It wasn't disbelief. It was the sound of a man filing a fact into exactly the right place inside a very organized mind. "Yes, sir. And the cause?" His assistant hesitated. That particular hesitation that always preceded something the speaker suspected would sound absurd. It started the same night the new maid arrived. Silence settled over the room like snow. Complete. Weightless. Min-kyu finally turned from the glass. "Name?" "Chioma, sir." He repeated it once, privately, as though testing its weight. Then he moved to his desk and sat, unhurried, deliberate, and folded his hands in front of him with the patience of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of information for a very long time. Because here was what Min-kyu understood about men like Jae-hyun. Men who had built their entire architecture of power on the foundation of being unbreakable. The moment they began to heal, they became readable. Jae-hyun's insomnia had been, paradoxically, his greatest protection. A man in constant psychological siege was unpredictable. Volatile in ways even he couldn't anticipate. You couldn't calculate the movements of someone who couldn't calculate his own. For 6 years, Min-kyu had watched and measured and planned, and for 6 years that single variable had made every plan provisional. But a Jae-hyun who was sleeping? A Jae-hyun who was softening, opening, allowing some unknown woman access to the part of him that everyone else was kept away from? That was a Jae-hyun with a shape. And a shape could be studied, anticipated, used. "I want everything," Min-kyu said quietly. "Her background, where she came from, who brought her in, how long she's been in contact with the household." "Yes, sir." Quietly, his eyes moved back to the river. "Nothing that reaches Jae-hyun's people. Nothing that looks like interest." "Understood." The assistant moved toward the door. "One more thing." The young man stopped. Min-kyu's voice, when it came, carried no heat. No anger. No excitement. Only that particular, measured calm that the people closest to him had learned to fear more than shouting. "Don't underestimate her because of what she is," he said. "In this world, the most dangerous people are always the ones nobody thought to watch." The door closed. Mingqiu sat alone with the river and the morning light and the slow, patient turn of his thoughts. Jaehyun had spent 6 years as an unmovable thing, a fixed point that the entire city's underworld had oriented itself around, the way lesser ships navigate by a lighthouse. Feared, untouchable, beyond reach. But lighthouses, Mingqiu reflected, were only useful when the sea was dark. If the king was healing, then the throne was unguarded. He reached for his phone. Across the city, inside the mansion's kitchen, Chioma stood alone in the early morning quiet. The humming had stopped, but her eyes, steady, unreadable, carrying something older than the room she stood in, were already moving toward the window. As though she could feel, at a distance she couldn't name, that somewhere in this city, someone had just begun to pay attention. Mrs. Yoon had worked in this mansion for 11 years. She had outlasted 4 head chefs, 9 rotating security details, and more maids than she had bothered counting after the 3rd year. She had learned the particular grammar of this household the way you learn a language spoken only in one place, through immersion, through mistake, through the slow accumulation of what was never said aloud. She knew, for instance, that certain hallways were louder than others after midnight. Not with sound, with pressure. The kind that settled in the walls of a house that had absorbed too much grief and didn't know how to release it. She knew which staff members had developed the habit of moving in straight lines, never lingering, never pausing near doorways, because stillness in this house had always felt like an invitation for something to go wrong. She knew the weight of a morning after a bad night. And she knew, standing in the east corridor at 7:30 with a linen inventory she had already completed twice, that this morning was different. She simply couldn't name why. It started with the kitchen staff. Small things. The kind that wouldn't register unless you had spent 11 years learning to read a household the way other people read weather. One of the younger attendants, a woman who had perfected the art of occupying as little space as possible, who set down cups as though she were defusing something, placed a tray on the counter that morning with a sound. Not a crash, not carelessness, just the ordinary, unremarkable sound of an object meeting a surface without apology. She didn't appear to notice she'd done it, but Mrs. Yoon did. By mid-morning, she had catalogued several more. A door left open that was habitually pulled shut. 2 members of the kitchen staff speaking to each other in normal voices. Not whispers. Not the compressed, careful exchanges that had become the household's default register. A junior attendant who paused in the corridor to straighten a painting that had been slightly crooked for, to Mrs. Yoon's memory, the better part of 4 months. For months, no one had touched it. This morning someone did, casually, as though the house were simply a place where people lived, and paintings were allowed to hang straight. Mrs. Yoon stood very still and watched. Chioma moved through all of it without comment. That was the thing Mrs. Yoon kept returning to as she observed the morning quietly from the margins. There was no performance in the young woman's presence. No attempt to announce herself or position herself at the center of what was shifting. She moved through the mansion's routines the way water moves through a space. Finding the shape of things, filling what was empty, disturbing nothing that didn't need disturbing. She restocked. She cleaned. She prepared. She responded when spoken to and did not manufacture conversation when she wasn't. At no point did she look like a woman who believed she had done something remarkable the night before. That restraint, Mrs. Yoon thought, was its own kind of intelligence. By afternoon, she stood in the entrance hall and allowed herself to simply feel the house. She had done this only a few times over 11 years. Stood in the large, cold silence of the main hall and taken the temperature of a space that had no thermostat for what it actually held. She had done it the night Jae-hyun returned from the hospital after the accident 3 years ago. She had done it the evening the last doctor packed his bag and left without speaking to anyone. She did it now. And what came back to her was not the familiar heaviness. Not the particular suspension she had grown so accustomed to, that sense of a house perpetually braced, perpetually waiting for something to shatter. The air simply sat. Not light exactly. Not transformed. The mansion was still what it was. Vast and expensive and guarded by its own history. But the held breath she had stopped noticing only because she had grown so used to it was gone. The walls were not listening the same way. The ceilings didn't feel low. She exhaled slowly and didn't know she'd been holding it. Upstairs, Jae-hyun moved through the afternoon with the careful attention of a man navigating a room that had been rearranged while he slept. Nothing was different. Every object occupied its correct position. Every surface held exactly what it had held the day before. And yet the silence felt altered in a way he had no vocabulary for. Lighter, less deliberate, as though the quiet had stopped performing itself and simply become what it was. He paused at the top of the staircase and looked down at the entrance hall below, at the ordinary, unhurried movement of his household going about its afternoon, and felt something he had no immediate name for. Not peace. He didn't trust peace, but the absence of dread. For the first time, the house was not waiting for him to break. He woke at 1:19 a.m., not at 1:17, not to the gunshot, not to the weight of her body or the cold fog of the parking structure closing over everything like a hand. Just awake. 2 minutes past the appointed hour, in a room that was only a room, with his own breathing the loudest thing in it. Jae-hyun lay completely still and stared at the ceiling. This was the part no one had prepared him for. Not the doctors with their careful language and their measured optimism. Not the specialists who had mapped his sleep cycles on clinical charts and spoken about trauma responses with the detached fluency of men who had never once been ambushed by their own minds at 1:17 in the morning. None of them had thought to mention what happened in the space left behind when the nightmare didn't come. What filled it? What didn't? He waited. His body waited with him, the old reflex still present, the musculature of 6 years of anticipation still coiled and ready for an assault that did not arrive. His jaw was tight. His hands had found the sheets without his instruction. Every nerve ending was prepared for the detonation. The clock read 1:21. Nothing. He sat up slowly, as though moving too quickly might trigger it. As though the nightmare were a sleeping thing nearby that he was trying not to disturb. But there was nothing to disturb. Only the dark. Only his own face, faintly reflected in the window glass. Only the city below, indifferent and glittering, continuing its business without him. By morning, the absence had become its own presence. He moved through the early hours with the disorientation of a man whose map had been redrawn overnight. Every ritual he reached for came up wrong. The particular focus he brought to the first hour after a bad night, that sharp, compensatory control, the way he weaponized exhaustion into precision, had nothing to sharpen itself against. There was no damage to manage, no cost to absorb. He stood at the window with his coffee and felt, with growing unease, that he did not know what to do with his own hands. This was the empire he had built. Not just in boardrooms and back alleys, but inside himself. The discipline, the silence, the impenetrable composure that other men read as power. He understood now, standing in the flat morning light, that he had constructed all of it on top of the wreckage. That the control hadn't come from strength. It had come from the nightly requirement to survive himself. Take away the wreckage. And the architecture had nothing to rest on. Who are you? Something in him asked quietly, when there is nothing left to endure. He had no answer. June came to him differently now. That was the thing that unsettled him most. More than the silence. More than the unfamiliar weight of an untroubled night. The memory hadn't vanished. He hadn't been emptied of her. But when her face arrived now, it came without the gunshot. Without the cold. Without the physical assault of that parking structure rising up to swallow him whole. She was simply there, standing at a slight distance, her coat buttoned, her hands folded, looking at him the way she always had, that particular patient sadness she reserved for conversations she already knew the ending of. Not bleeding, not falling, just present. And somehow that was worse. The violence had been horrific, but it had been hers, immediate, urgent, impossible to look away from. This quiet version asked something different of him. Required him to look at her face without the mercy of crisis to focus on. Required him to simply miss her, cleanly, without the noise. He wasn't sure he knew how. He found Chioma in the corridor outside the library without meaning to. She was doing something ordinary. Adjusting a window latch that had been stiff for days, apparently. She didn't turn when he approached, and he didn't announce himself. For a moment they simply occupied the same stretch of hallway in silence. She's quieter now, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. Chioma stilled briefly, then continued with the latch. Who? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She turned then, and looked at him with that level, unhurried attention, the gaze that seemed less like observation and more like listening. That frightens you, she said. It wasn't a question. It feels like losing her again, he said. The words surprised him. He was not a man who said things like that aloud. Chioma was quiet for a moment. Then, you are not losing her. She held his gaze. You are leaving the moment. He frowned. There's no difference. There is, she said simply. She is still there. You are just no longer standing over her body. The words landed with the precision of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. He had nothing to put against them. He returned to his study and sat without turning on the lights and stayed there while the morning moved through the windows and the house continued its quiet, breathing life around him. He had held on to the nightmare for 6 years the way a man grips the wreckage after a shipwreck. Not because the wreckage was safe, but because it was something solid in open water. Because letting go didn't mean swimming. It meant finding out whether he could. The nightmare had been his evidence. Proof that she had existed. Proof that he had failed her. Proof that he was still, underneath everything, capable of something that resembled feeling. Without it, he was only himself. And for the first time, he didn't know what to hold on to. By 11 p.m., he was already dressed. Not in the loose clothing of a man preparing for sleep. In the same dark shirt he had worn through the afternoon, sleeves pushed to the forearm, as though the night were a meeting he intended to be present for. He stood in the center of his bedroom and looked at the bed, that wide, white, carefully made architecture of a thing, and then turned away from it deliberately. Not tonight. He had spent 6 years in that bed waiting to be ambushed. He wasn't going to lie down and perform the ritual of a man expecting rest he wasn't sure he deserved yet. If it was coming, he would meet it standing. He moved to the window instead and watched the city arrange itself into its nighttime configuration. Lights softening, traffic thinning, soul slowly exhaling into the particular quiet that only existed between midnight and the hours that followed. He had watched this transition more times than he could count, always from the same position, always with the same cold knot forming somewhere behind his sternum as the hour climbed toward 1:17. Tonight the knot was there, but it had a different shape. Less dread. More, he searched for the word and found it reluctantly. Anticipation, which unsettled him more than the dread had. Chioma did not come to him this time. At 12:30 she was in the corridor outside his room. He heard the faint sound of her moving past, unhurried, no different than if it were midday, but she did not stop, did not knock, did not appear with the cup or the quiet entrance or any of the architecture of the previous night that his body had already begun, treacherously, to expect. He waited. She didn't return. By 12:50 he had moved from the window to the doorway of his room. And then, with the halting deliberateness of a man doing something he hadn't decided to do yet, into the corridor itself. The hallway was dim and still. Wall lights at quarter intensity cast everything in a low amber that made the space feel less like a house and more like something between sleeping and waking. Chioma sat on the floor at the far end of the corridor with her back against the wall. One knee drawn up, doing nothing in particular. No cup, no task. She looked up when he appeared but said nothing. He walked toward her slowly. She watched him cover the distance without moving, without adjusting her posture into something more formal, without performing the deference that everyone else in this house wore like a second uniform. When he reached her, she gestured beside her. Simply. No words. He looked at the floor. At her. At the floor again. Then he sat. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was the strange thing. It had the texture of something chosen rather than something endured. He became aware of the wall solid behind his back, the floor beneath him, the corridor extending in both directions into soft darkness. Grounded. That was the word. He felt obscurely grounded. 1:05. You didn't come, he said. No, Chioma agreed. Why? She turned her head slightly toward him. Because you didn't need me to come to you. You needed to come to it. He absorbed that without answering. 1:10. His hands rested on his knees and he felt the familiar tightening beginning its ascent, the physiological countdown that his body ran with mechanical indifference to his intentions. Pulse at the surface. Jaw beginning its slow lock. The breath narrowing by degrees. It's starting, he said, not alarmed, just honest. I know, she said. Let it. 1:13. The edges of the memory arrived first, the way they always did. Not the center was always last, always worst, but the periphery. cold air, the particular quality of underground silence, the smell of frost and exhaust and something faintly floral that his mind had spent 6 years preserving with horrible fidelity. His shoulders drew upward involuntarily. Chioma didn't move. "Stay in the corridor," she said quietly. "Not a comfort. An instruction. Feel the floor." He pressed his palms flat against the ground. Cold. Smooth. Real. 1:15. The fog thickened in the edges of his mind and the parking structure began assembling itself with that dreadful architectural precision. Concrete columns, fractured light, the echo of a sound not yet arrived. "What do you hear right now?" Chioma's voice. Level. Present. He pushed against the question. Right now. This corridor. What do you hear?" He heard. The faint mechanical breath of the building settling. A distant siren, 3 streets away, growing smaller. His own breathing. He said. "Then stay with that." 1:16. The memory surged, cold and sudden and enormous. The way a wave doesn't announce itself until it has already blocked the sky. And then Chioma's hand closed around his. Warm. Immediate. A fact so present it occupied the same space the memory was trying to claim. He stopped. Both things existed simultaneously, the past assembling its full weight in one direction, and this, a hand, a corridor, a floor, a voice. "You are here." She didn't say it this time. She didn't need to. The clock turned. 1:17. The gunshot didn't come. The memory reached its fullest pressure. Jiun's coat, the shadow shifting behind the pillar, the terrible geometry of what happened next. And then, at the precise moment it should have detonated. Fractured. Not disappeared. Not erased. It cracked along some new fault line, the pieces still present but separated, stripped of the velocity that had always made it unbearable. He felt it happen the way you feel ice give under weight. A structural failure, irreversible, changing the nature of what it had been. His body shuddered once, deeply, the way it did when something held too long was finally released. Then stillness. They sat without speaking for a long time afterward. The city continued below. The corridor held them both in its amber quiet. At some point, he couldn't have said when, Chioma withdrew her hand, and the absence was manageable, which itself felt like a kind of progress. "It's different," he said finally. The same word she had used the night before. "Yes. It still came. It will keep coming," she said. "For a while." He looked at the middle distance. "But it didn't finish." She said nothing to that. She didn't need to. He sat with it, with the incomplete memory, the fractured sequence, the strange unresolved quiet of a nightmare that had, for the first time in 6 years, failed to reach its ending. It wasn't victory. It wasn't peace. But it was something that had not existed yesterday, and he turned it over carefully in the silence, the way you handle something fragile that you are not yet sure belongs to you. The memory hadn't won, but it wasn't gone. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, something in Jaehyun was beginning, slowly and without permission, to breathe. The kitchen at 3 a.m. belonged to no one. That was the thing Chioma had noticed in her first days here, how the house distributed itself across the hours, different rooms belonging to different silences. The study belonged to the early evening, heavy with whatever Jaehyun carried into it and couldn't put down. The corridors belonged to the dead hours before midnight, when the staff had retired and the house breathed through its own architecture. The entrance hall belonged to mornings, when light came through the high windows at an angle that almost made the space feel ordinary. But the kitchen at this hour belonged to no one, which meant it belonged to her. She moved through it without turning on the overhead lights, working instead by the lower counter lights that cast everything in a clean, practical yellow. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't preparing anything that needed preparing. She was simply occupying the space the way she sometimes needed to after a night like this one. Moving her hands through familiar tasks, letting the body do something simple while the mind settled. She filled the kettle, set it on the element, stood with both hands flat on the counter and looked at nothing in particular, and let herself carefully feel the weight of what she was carrying. She had learned a long time ago not to do this in front of anyone. Not the watching, not the calibration, not the particular quality of attention she brought to a person in crisis, That deep, almost structural listening that went beyond words into the register of breathing patterns and posture and the specific way a person's silence changed shape depending on what it was protecting. People found it unsettling when they noticed it. She had been told at various points in her life that she saw too much, that she was too quiet, that there was something in the steadiness of her attention that felt less like comfort and more like being read. She had stopped apologizing for it, but she had learned to keep it contained, to work beneath the surface, invisible, so that the person she was helping never felt handled, never felt observed. Because the moment someone in that kind of pain became aware of being watched, they retreated back behind the wall, back into the performance of being fine, back into the thousand small disciplines of a person who had decided that survival meant never being caught in need. Jae-hyun was exactly that kind of person, which meant everything she did had to feel like nothing. The kettle began its low build toward boiling. She didn't move. Her mind moved back to the corridor, to his hand beneath hers, to the particular quality of his stillness when the memory fractured, that deep, involuntary shudder, the body releasing something it had been clenching for years. She had felt it travel up through his arm, had recognized it with a familiarity that had nothing to do with this house, this man, this city. She had felt it before. Not once. Many times. She closed her eyes briefly and the kitchen in Seoul became, for a moment, a different room in a different place. Smaller, warmer, smelling of something other than marble and expensive air. A man sitting at a table in the early hours, not a mafia boss but a man in the same essential condition. Fractured at the load-bearing points, holding himself upright through sheer accumulated habit, no longer certain whether the thing keeping him together was strength or simply the absence of an alternative. She had sat with that man too, had learned, through him, that trauma was not a story that ended. It was a process that moved, sometimes forward, sometimes sideways, sometimes doubling back without warning through a smell or a sound or a particular quality of winter light. That it could not be extracted like a splinter. That the only way through it was exactly what the word implied. Through. Present. Awake. Grounded in something real while the unreal made its passage. Some wounds, he had told her once, near the end of it, don't belong to one person. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. The kettle reached its boil and she poured without measuring, the muscle memory of the action requiring nothing from her conscious mind. Because here was the thing she hadn't said to Jae-hyun. The thing she kept behind her teeth when he asked why she stayed. Why she understood. Why she wasn't afraid of what she found in the corners of his particular darkness. She wasn't unafraid. She was familiar. There was a difference, and it mattered. Unfamiliarity produced fear or fascination. Both were useless. Familiarity produced something steadier. A kind of clear-eyed recognition, stripped of drama, that said, I know what this is. I know what it asks. I know what it costs. She knew the cost. She had paid a version of it already in a different currency in a different life, which was why she was careful. More careful than she appeared. More deliberate than the quietness of her movements suggested. Because helping someone through this kind of damage was not a passive act. It looked passive, the sitting, the stillness, the refusal to push or explain or resolve. But underneath the stillness was a constant, exhausting vigilance. A tracking of where he was in the process and where the process was taking him and what the next necessary thing was before he knew he needed it. She wasn't reacting to Jae-hyun. She was anticipating him. She stood at the kitchen window with her cup and looked out at the city's distant, indifferent glow. Min-kyu's name had come to her 3 days ago, not spoken aloud, but present in the way things became present when you were paying the right quality of attention. A reference too carefully omitted from a staff conversation. A shift in Mrs. Yoon's posture when someone mentioned the offices across the river. Small things. The kind that didn't mean anything individually and meant everything in sequence. She filed it without changing her expression and continued preparing breakfast. Because there was a difference, she had always known this, between someone healing and someone being safe. The two were not the same thing. Did not travel together automatically. Sometimes healing made a person less safe, not more, because it changed them in ways the people around them hadn't consented to and couldn't control. She thought of Jae-hyun in the corridor. The shudder. The fractured memory. The way he had sat with the incomplete feeling afterward, turning it over, not yet knowing what it meant. He thought this was recovery. And it was. But it was also something else. something she could see from her angle that he couldn't yet see from his. Healing this kind of man didn't just change him, it changed the entire gravitational field of his world. The people who had oriented themselves around his damage would feel the shift, would respond to it. Some of them would come closer out of concern. Others would come closer for different reasons entirely. She wasn't just helping him survive the nights. She was preparing him for what came after them. It started with a meeting, not an unusual one. The kind Jae-hyun convened every Thursday morning in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the building that officially housed an asset management firm and unofficially housed everything else. 6 men around a long table. Reports delivered, numbers reconciled, problems named and resolved with the particular efficiency that had always characterized the way Jae-hyun ran things. Except this Thursday, he didn't speak for the first 12 minutes. He listened. That was new. Not the listening itself. Jae-hyun had always been a man who gathered information before deploying it. But there was a quality to his attention this morning that the men around the table couldn't immediately classify. He sat back in his chair rather than forward. His hands rested open on the table rather than folded. He let the reports run longer than usual, interrupting nothing, correcting nothing, allowing the full shape of each situation to present itself before he spoke. When he finally did speak, he asked a question no one had anticipated. What does the other side want? Silence. The man presenting, a senior figure who had been delivering these reports for 4 years without once being asked that particular question, blinked once. Sir, the dispute in the Mapo situation, Jae-hyun said. We've established what we want. I'm asking what they want. Another silence, different in texture. The kind that forms when a room full of people is recalibrating simultaneously. We haven't assessed that, sir. Jae-hyun nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Assess it, he said. Bring me the answer before we move. The meeting continued. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of that room, and every man present felt it without being able to name it precisely, the way you feel a change in air pressure before you can identify the source. The word moved quickly, the way words always moved in systems built on surveillance. By afternoon, it had traveled through 3 layers of the organization, gathering interpretation as it went. By evening, it had reached the people whose entire function was to monitor the temperature of Jae-hyun's decision-making and report anomalies upward. The report was simple, he hesitated. Which was not accurate, he hadn't hesitated. He had considered. But in a world where his value was predicated on the perception of absolute certainty, the distinction was invisible. What his people had always sold, to partners, to rivals, to the rotating cast of men who needed to believe that aligning with Jae-hyun meant aligning with something immovable, was the certainty. Not just his power but the quality of his power. The sense that decisions made in his name were final before they were spoken, inevitable before they were enacted. A man who asked what the other side wanted introduced doubt into that equation. And doubt, in their world, was structural damage. The subordinates felt it in smaller ways that accumulated. A reprimand that didn't come when one was expected. A boundary tested gently. A minor territory question left unresolved for a day longer than the old Jae-hyun would have tolerated. And not immediately punished. Individually, each thing was explicable. Collectively, they produced a low, collective unease, the way a flock changes direction before any single bird can articulate why. They were not afraid of him in the same register anymore. They were still careful, still deferential. The architecture of fear he had built over years was not so fragile that a few weeks could dissolve it. But fear, at its most functional, required certainty of consequence. The certainty was softening at the edges. And men who lived inside systems of power developed an almost biological sensitivity to that kind of softening. Across the river, Min-kyu received his Thursday report with the same unreadable composure he brought to everything. He read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read the specific section again, the Mapo question, the 12 minutes of silence, the request for information no one had thought to gather. Then he did something he rarely did in the presence of his assistant. He smiled. Not warmly. The way a man smiles when a long calculation finally resolves, when a variable he has been tracking for months reveals its value and the value is exactly what he needed it to be. He's thinking differently, his assistant offered carefully. Yes, Min-kyu said. Is that concerning? Ming-Q set the report down and straightened it against the desk with one precise movement. A man who thinks differently makes different decisions. He paused. Different decisions create gaps. Gaps create opportunities. He stood and moved to the window. Below, the Han River carried its indifferent weight toward the sea. The same as always, moved by nothing but gravity and its own accumulated momentum. Double the Mapo presence, he said quietly. Nothing visible. Nothing that breaks the surface. And if Jae-hyun notices, then we'll know his instincts are still intact. His reflection in the glass was calm, patient, almost scholarly. And if he doesn't, he left the sentence unfinished. He didn't need to finish it. They didn't fear him the same way anymore. And that was dangerous. Came without warning. Not at 117. Not in the corridor with the amber lights and the solid floor beneath him. Not in any of the circumstances he had begun carefully to associate with the memory's arrival, as though it had a schedule, a preferred geography, a set of conditions under which it operated. It came at 4 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday, in the library, while he was reading a contract he had already read twice. A smell. That was all. Something in the air recycling through the vents. A combination of things, ordinary things that shouldn't have meant anything, but which assembled themselves into something his memory recognized before his conscious mind could intervene. Her perfume, the one she always wore, the one he had once told her, in a moment of uncharacteristic openness, reminded him that gentleness still existed somewhere. He set the contract down. The memory that came was not the parking structure. That was the first thing that registered, distantly, as though observed from a slight remove, the almost clinical awareness that what was arriving was different. No fog, no cold, no underground architecture assembling itself around him with that dreadful, familiar precision. Instead, summer, a rooftop he hadn't thought about in years. Late afternoon light coming in at an angle that turned everything gold. The distant sound of the city several stories below, reduced by height and warmth to something almost peaceful. And Ji-eun, sitting cross-legged on a blanket she had carried up 3 flights of stairs without telling him why, laughing at something he had said. Really laughing, the kind that involved her whole face, the kind she couldn't perform or moderate. He had said something self-deprecating. He couldn't remember what, but he remembered her response. You are so much funnier than you let anyone see. He had deflected immediately. Some dry, dismissive thing that closed the door she had briefly opened. But she hadn't let him close it entirely. She had looked at him with that particular expression, the one that coexisted with the laughter, the one that said, I see exactly what you're doing and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Stop protecting yourself from good things, she had said. It's an exhausting habit. He had not had an answer for that. He sat in the library now with the contract forgotten in his hands and let the memory be what it was. Not an assault. Not an accusation. Just an afternoon on a rooftop 6 years ago, with a woman who had found his deflections more amusing than intimidating, who had treated the most feared man in Seoul like someone who simply hadn't yet learned how to sit still in sunlight. He had loved her. He had never, in 6 years of reliving her death, allowed himself to land on that fact with any gentleness. The grief had always arrived through the violence, wrapped in guilt, indistinguishable from it. But here, without the parking structure, without the cold and the blood and the weight of her body, the feeling sat clean and uncomplicated in the center of his chest. He had loved her. She had known it. She had chosen, every day, to stay inside the wreckage of his world and love him back in whatever form he could manage. That was not a tragedy to carry. That was something else entirely. You promised you'd choose life. Her voice arrived quietly this time. No violence behind it. No whispered indictment from a dying woman. Just her voice. The same voice that had told him he was funnier than he let anyone see, that called his self-protection an exhausting habit, that had stood in an underground parking structure not with anger but with the particular sadness of someone who already knew how the conversation would end. You promised. He understood, sitting in the library with the afternoon light on his hands, what she had meant. Not survive. Anyone could survive. He had been surviving for 6 years with spectacular, grinding efficiency. She had meant, live, differently, openly, in the direction of the future rather than in permanent vigil over a past that was finished. She had not asked him to forget her. She had asked him to stop using her memory as a reason to stay inside the moment she died. He had been so faithful to that moment, had returned to it every night with a devotion that felt like loyalty but was, he now understood, something closer to punishment. A sentence he had handed himself and served without question because it was the only form of being close to her that still felt available. But she was not in that parking structure. She was on a rooftop, laughing, telling him to stop protecting himself from good things. He could go there instead. He didn't hear Chioma in the doorway. She had been there for some minutes. He understood that later, from the quality of the silence, the sense of another presence that had made no attempt to announce itself or intervene. She had simply stood and waited and allowed what was happening to happen at its own pace and resolution. When he finally looked up, her expression held nothing that required a response. No question, no concern performing itself as attentiveness. Just the steady, clear presence that he had come to understand was its own form of language. "I think I've been in the wrong place," he said. She nodded once, as though she had been waiting quietly for him to find his way to exactly that sentence. He looked back at the window. The afternoon light was still there. For the first time, he chose not to go back. He slept at 11:47 p.m. No corridor. No floor. No counted seconds or grounding hand or careful voice threading him back from the edge of a memory that wanted to swallow him whole. He simply lay down in his own bed, in the dark, and closed his eyes, and the dark received him without condition. 1:17 came and went. He didn't notice. Mrs. Yoon discovered it by accident. She had developed over 6 years the habit of moving past his door at certain hours. Not to check, she would have said, if anyone had asked. Simply to pass. To register in the particular way the body registers things it has been trained to monitor, whether the light beneath the door was on or off, whether the silence had that certain held quality, or whether it was simply silence. At 2 a.m. she passed his door and stopped. No light. She stood for a moment longer than necessary, her hand not quite touching the door frame, and listened. From inside, nothing. The specific, textured nothing of a room containing a person who was genuinely, completely asleep. She stood there for a long time. Then she walked back to her own room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands flat against her knees and allowed herself, in private, to feel the full weight of what 11 years in this house had cost her. What it had cost all of them. The accumulated vigilance of it. The way fear, sustained long enough, stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like the natural condition of things. She had forgotten, somewhere in those 11 years, that it hadn't always been like this. She remembered now. Chioma stood at the kitchen window at 3 a.m. and watched the city. She had not slept. Not because she couldn't, she was tired in the deep, bone-level way that came from sustained, invisible effort, but because something in the quality of the night felt unfinished. Some low frequency of attention she had learned, over years, not to dismiss. Behind her, the house breathed. Ahead of her, the city's lights held their cold, in different positions against the dark. She thought about what healing looked like from the outside. How it changed the shape of a person in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. The loosening of the jaw. The different quality of eye contact. The way a man who had been braced against the world for years began, almost imperceptibly, to take up space differently, less contained, less armored, less organized entirely around the management of damage. Jae-hyun was becoming readable, and she was glad for him and afraid for him in equal measure. The message arrived at 3:17 a.m., not to her. She had no reason to receive messages in this house, and no one outside it who would send one at this hour. But she heard the shift, a sound from the security station at the east end of the ground floor, a particular sequence of tones that indicated an external communication had been received and flagged for morning review. She wouldn't have thought anything of it, except that 40 minutes later, she heard a car. Not at the front gate. The front gate had its own acoustic signature, familiar and routine. This was further away, parked, not passing, on the residential street that ran along the mansion's eastern perimeter, which saw no traffic at this hour because it led nowhere that anyone had reason to go at 3 a.m. She stood very still at the window. The car didn't move. After 10 minutes it was gone, engine starting once, briefly, then silence, and she remained at the window for a long time afterward, working through the architecture of what she had just observed with the methodical attention of someone who had learned that dismissed details had a way of becoming critical ones. Ming-Qiu. The name arrived not as conclusion but as direction. The place her thinking had been traveling toward for days, the figure at the far end of a sequence of small, easily explained things that were becoming harder to explain individually the more of them accumulated. She had known this was coming. She had known it in the abstract, theoretical way you know that a storm is seasonal, that it will arrive, that its arrival is not a surprise, that the only real question is timing. She understood now that the timing was no longer abstract. She went upstairs. Not to wake him. Not to warn him or position herself in any of the ways that the situation, assessed coldly, might have justified. She stopped outside his door and stood in the hallway and listened, and from inside came the same steady, uninterrupted silence Mrs. Yoon had found an hour before. He was still asleep. She pressed her fingertips lightly against the door frame and looked at nothing and felt, moving through her in a single quiet wave, the full complicated weight of what she was watching happen. He had done it. After 6 years of nightly devastation, after every doctor and every remedy and every carefully constructed coping mechanism had failed him, he had found his way back to something as simple and as enormous as a full night's sleep. Not through power, not through control, through the slow, unglamorous, deeply human work of allowing himself to be reached. She was glad. She was also afraid in a way that had nothing to do with herself, because she understood, with the clarity of someone who had watched this particular sequence before, in different places with different people, that healing this visible in a world this ruthless did not go unnoticed. That the people who had built their strategies around a broken Jaehyun were not going to quietly revise their plans. That the car on the eastern street at 3 a.m. was not the beginning of something. It was the signal that something had already begun. She stayed until the light outside began its first, tentative shift toward morning. Then she walked back to the kitchen, and filled the kettle, and stood in the growing gray light with both hands on the counter and made herself think clearly about what came next. What he would need. What she knew. What she was still deciding whether to tell him. He had finally found peace. But in his world, peace was never protection. It was a signal. And somewhere in the city, someone had just decided to take everything from him.